Good evening, everyone. This is Leonardo Maduro-Salvarrey, and my research paper was on the topic of neo-pagan practices in my spiritual congregation. So, a little background. The population I surveyed was a group of people in my Unitarian Universalist congregation. And when Unitarian Universalism is that it's sort of a branching off of Christianity, and it's made up of these two previously Christian sects, the Unitarians and the Universalists, and I think they came together in like the 1950s. But yeah, they're non-dogmatic, and so they have a wide variety. Among their sort of congregants, there's a wide variety of different types of beliefs, and among them is among the congregation are people who consider themselves to be pagans. And I just recently found out, actually, like maybe 2 or 3 years ago, that there's a pretty high there's a pretty high percentage of like pagans in my congregation, and I was curious about that. So I just thought this assignment would be a good way of exploring um how they practice their faith and their spirituality. So I had a few questions when I started this assignment, and the first one was, and the chief among them was, how is paganism really practiced in my UU community? Because even for as long as I'd known that there are pagans in my UU church, I hadn't really seen them do any of their rituals, right? I had never attended any of their rituals. I hadn't really seen them do anything like specific. So I came up with a hypothesis, that but based on what I had already seen and a little bit of what I had read, previously in my life, that I had come up with this hypothesis that the ritual activity of pagans in my UU congregation would be centered around Celtic, Norse, and Germanic mythology. So I was expecting to see a lot of references to the Norse pantheon, Celtic deities, um, and not just like stories, but also the sort of iconography that I see people, like wearing or sporting. So that was my main hypothesis. But then, after the Corona outbreak, I also wondered how it would impact the how they conducted rituals, right? Because my understanding had been, and my understanding had always been that pagan pagan like spirituality has a lot to do with the earth, right? And like with natural settings. So I was wondering how they would like conduct rituals without being able to meet up in a natural setting to, you know, do a to work some magic, to complete a ritual. So, there were some obstacles and some advantages, as there are with any research assignment, and the most obvious obstacle, excuse me, was the COVID-19 pandemic, which really kind of didn't allow me to meet with my informants in person, which I think it would have had a lot of benefits to it to be able to meet with my informants in person, but that was not an option. So I had to overcome that obstacle, and also just being pretty much stuck at home, just working, like walking the dog and stuff. It's kind of like a sudden shift in structure compared to my usual like academic schedule. So that was also a slight road bump, speed bump, if you will, to overcome. However, the one advantage of this is that I had more time to work on my assignment because I commute to campus, and I would have had less time to work on my assignments commuting, which I didn't have to do, right? Because I didn't have to commute anymore. So that was an advantage. So my primary method for data collection was the use of interviews, and I conducted a total of 3 interviews, and they were all online, as I previously stated, and they were about an hour long on average, and they were all semi-structured. It's the second one was more structured than the first one. I'd say the second one was structured than the third one too, but that's just due to some scheduling conflicts and such. But yeah, and I spoke to three men. Um, they're I'd like to have spoken to some women too, but because I actually know some, I know a couple of I know a few congregants from my congregation that are part of this group, and they are women, but like I was not able to reach out to them. I wasn't able to really contact them, so I just used these three individuals as a population to the population, like the sample population, and I used the sort of grand tour format where I asked them about their life story to sort of contextualize what they would tell me about their beliefs and how they practice their beliefs. And and then I recorded that. Now I also attempted to approximate the experience of a of participant observation in the form of sort of remotely watching this event that they practice because so specifically, and one of my informants told me this, the pagans and my like the sort of more structured group of pagans in my congregation, they specifically refer to themselves as druids. Like their sort of type of paganism is druidry, and kind of the idiosyncrasy with druids is that they celebrate 8 specific holidays throughout the year, 4 to celebrate the spring and four to celebrate the summer and winter solstices, and 4 to celebrate the summer and winter solstices, and 4 to celebrate the summer and winter solstices, and also the spring and fall equinoxes. And then the other 4 are meant to represent or are meant to celebrate the beginning of new season of the 4 seasons, right? And so I was just in time. It just so happened to be able to observe the Alban Ailer, um, the Alban Ailer ritual, which sort of celebrates the beginning of spring. And it was there actually that I learned um, a lot of different things about sort of druidic cosmology, at least in the sort of more formal ritual space and how it was referred to. And they made mention of the 4 directions and a different sort of one of my informants called them treasures associated with each direction, and each one is associated with a different Celtic deity. You've got the cauldron, the sword, the stone of destiny, and the spear. The spear belongs to Lu, but I don't remember who the other relics belong to at the moment because the spelling's really intense. But so yeah, that's all the data I pretty much recorded from my participant observation. I also um, I also recorded some data from my some of the data I'd recorded from my informants. Something interesting about them was that you see the way I'd gone about recording a lot of my data was I'd ask about their sort of spiritual upbringings, right? Because this was such a particular phenomenon, this sort of neo-pagan kind of spiritual tradition, that I wanted to know if like there might be any sort of underlying pattern between like um, religious upbringing and them joining neo-paganism. And but of course I had come up with the idea to figure that out under the sort of idea that neo-paganism was like more centralized, which it wasn't. And that's something I saw a lot of when I got answers from them, because they one of them I mean they all consider themselves pagan, right? But one of them is he strictly considers himself more of a druid. Another one, he he was part of this group called the Atlanta Fairies because because of the because in that specific sort of cultural context, um it was kind of his sexuality was kind of frowned upon by like wider American society, and so he joined a group that wasn't just pagan, but they were also sort of sexuality positive. And my third informant, he was basically also a druid, but also he he said he practiced what he called hidden religion a lot, and it involved a lot of sensorial sort of input, a lot of different types of entheogenic sort of methods for communing with the divine, as opposed to the another informant that he was more about interested in the academic sort of aspects of Druidry. So my analysis indicated then that, yeah, as I had just said, they all considered themselves to be pagan, but there were different types of pagan, right? And while they were all part of the sort of druid circle, that's what they call it, the circle, in or the grove. Grove is a more accurate term. While they're all part of it, their identities aren't necessarily Celtic. Now, one of my informants did say that he felt that he had at one time physically communicated with a Celtic deity, but that's kind of sort of not the same experience as my first informant, who had he had spoken about how he doesn't really see visions like a lot of other people, but rather he feels sensations, and he equates different sensations with different sort of beings of and he's kind of sort of fostered connections with those beings. So, in conclusion, Druidic culture in my congregation is more varied than I had initially suspected in terms of practices, both amongst different individuals and practices of a single individual. Um, However, the one commonality among all these different identities was the sort of focusing on nature and on, healing intent, and on the sort of honoring of the three realms of earth, sea, and sky, and of and just like respecting Mother Nature. So I conclude that while my hypotheses on the physical ritual practices were um, in the general sense correct, that I was also not looking at the same picture, which is what happens a lot in ethnographic. Well, what happens pretty much every time in ethnographic studies. So I concluded that there's a lot more, of course, that to be studied, and that I that while the specific sort of rituals practiced in my congregation are what you would consider quote unquote Celtic, quote unquote, because Celtic is kind of a broad sort of umbrella term that doesn't have really any definite sort of necessarily descriptors. But so anyway, I concluded that while the specific rituals were Celtic or European, or like a mix, or like a sort of mix of different things from like Europe in general, that did not necessarily permeate entirely to the pagan practice or identity in my congregation. So that was my presentation. Thank you for watching, and stay safe, everyone. Um, have a great summer.